Hey folks, welcome to part 2 of the lecture on the politics of, the everyday politics, the connections between everyday life and the financial crisis. We were just talking about, museums, oddly, and artwork and the kind of mindset that it takes to appreciate a museum. And in a sense that this aesthetically sensitive mind, is a mind that's open to appreciating diverse perspectives, diverse points of view. And I think it's the idea of an aesthetic mind that leaves Rancière capable of thinking about a new approach to democracy, one that understands that the logic of the economy is not the only logic that we live to serve. We should also live to serve ourselves, our needs as human beings. The image in this slide is related to this question in some ways because it's a photograph that I took myself actually back in 2008 in September when I was in New York City, and it was a couple of days after Lehman Brothers, which is the bank named here on the plaque, this was right outside their building, had collapsed. Lehman Brothers, a bank that was so big that it was, as they said, too big to fail. I want to connect the question of finance and the circumstances through which this bank failed to the theme of the aesthetic that we've been trying to elaborate in the last slide. And more broadly, we've been talking about the financialization of life, which means in a way that we have become more calculative. We've been forced to become more calculative, more disciplined in the rhythms of our everyday life, realizing that those rhythms are in today's economy, potential sources of value and capital for us as entrepreneurs of ourselves, if you will, in terms of preparing ourselves and making ourselves ready to enter into this thing called the economy. We've talked already about student debt, about the self-policing that students have to do today in order to be successful in relation to the economy, and the kind of cruelty of that in some ways, I don't mind telling you. We are then in our daily lives exposed to the economy in ways we weren't before. The lack of a recovery, the shallowness of the recovery, I think shows that our lives are political in these new and ordinary everyday ways. Our ordinary everyday lives then have been politicized and financialized by the financial crisis. So, this photograph, I was in New York City, I was visiting, and it was the day really, or just a couple of days after the Dow Jones had lost about 4% of its value, which is represents an enormous loss of value really for something that large, for a basket of value that was that large. And it was in the 2 weeks after I took this photograph, it would lose about 7% of its value further, as investors lost confidence in the stock market and moved their money out of stocks and into gold and other less volatile commodities like government bonds. And the question is, I suppose, how to connect this image and the drama of the day that it was taken, the tension of the day that it was taken, the historical significance of this day, and to connect it to this world we now live in, post-2008, where we have these new responsibilities, these new ways in which our everyday lives are sort of constantly on the brink of emergency, and in which there is no space for the aesthetic mind to exist. So why are we in a recession today? we have a couple of variables to consider. First of all, there was the need for a new market. There was, as we've already observed, difficulty in the early part of the last decade with the collapse of the dot-com bubble, which was a bubble, an inflationary bubble, a price bubble that existed in the computer industry sector. A lot of stocks that were being traded that were pertaining to information technology were very, very popular. More popular, really, than they were worth. If we read Michael Wolff's famous novel, or rather account of this, it was called Burn Rate. It's a wonderful book to read. Explains in very simple terms the background and context of the dot-com bubble bursting. So this bubble was symptomatic, if you will, of a kind of an economy that had emerged in the 1970s through to the 90s, which was an economy based on the pursuit of financialized wealth, right? The pursuit of making money through acquiring and owning money. Prior to this, of course, and I'm stereotyping a little bit because, of course, this is not a black or white story. When I talk about the financialized economy, it doesn't mean that the old economy is no longer there, but it does mean that things are being done a little bit differently, and that the sort of the dominant trend in the economy has shifted somewhat. So the new economy still had farmers and still had people making things, but there was a lot more of the profit being generated in the economy coming from the financial sector. And this bubble bursting synchronized with a longer term trend that had been going on since the 1970s, which I've been trying to speak to a certain extent, which is that productivity, while it had been increasing, as we mentioned in the last hour, real incomes for the middle class had not really been recovering. And so there was a need on part of the middle class, if they were going to sustain the lifestyle that they were used to finance that lifestyle with debt. And it was a time where, after the bubble bursting in the early part of the last decade, we had a tremendous surplus of cash floating around the economy looking for a productive return. And probably oversimplifying a little bit here, but it can be said, I think, that cash found its way into Main Street banks with a view to financing probably the only real cash cow left in town, which was the need of this middle class to finance its own lifestyle. The revenue that you could generate by financing through debt this lifestyle, if you were Wall Street, looked pretty juicy. It looked like a ripe fruit ready to be plucked. And given that there weren't many other bubbles potentially around to invest in, this looked like a useful opportunity. So what that means is there was a lot of cash flowing to these people in the later part of the last decade, and it was creating an inflationary bubble because people could afford through mortgages, through cheap, low interest mortgages, to buy houses they might not otherwise have been able to buy. So we've just discussed this really interesting phenomena that happened in the build-up to 2008, which was that Wall Street, with a lot of cash on its hands, was flushing cash into the banking system, the downtown banking system, the banking system that you or I would use in our day-to-day lives. Importantly, these two types of banks have historically been kept apart from each other in the United States. And so it's worth taking some time now to think about how it came to pass that the downtown banking system, the Main Street banking system, and the Wall Street banking system, which is to do usually with investment capital, how they were originally separated, and then what happened to them such that they were able to come back together again. And to answer this question, we need to talk about the GlassSteagall Act, which was passed in 1933 after the 1929 stock market crash, which was prior to the one that we've just had, the biggest US banking failure in history, and in some ways a lot worse than the one we've just been through, because many of the techniques for resolving banking crises hadn't been invented yet, and really they were just being conceptualized and rolled out and developed for the first time. Now, you may remember the movie It's a Wonderful Life, where Jimmy Stewart plays the role of a downtown banker. In that financial crisis, the financial crisis of the 30s, what had happened was that downtown banks had become overzealous and tried to take the savings that people had given to them and invest those savings on Wall Street. Wall Street was a volatile market, and so it wasn't clear that those savings would necessarily gain a profit that the downtown or Main Street bankers were hoping it would. Indeed, it was a very risky move, and after some time, the bubble that this cash had created on Wall Street naturally burst. Most bubbles burst at some point, sooner or later. It's the old principle, what goes up must come down. The movie It's a Wonderful Life is interesting because it speaks to this time in history and this account of what happens when downtown banks play risky games with people's savings. As a way of remedying that possibility, the GlassSteagall Act was passed, and as we say here in the quote in the inset by Jean-Marie Eviard, GlassSteagall protected bankers against themselves. Bankers are sheep. They don't mind going over the cliff if everyone else goes over the cliff too. So what did GlassSteagall do to save the day? Well, obviously there was going to be depression for a long time to come, but eventually it was resolved. And when it was resolved, the GlassSteagall Act, having been passed, was there to make sure that it never happened again, because it separated investment and commercial banking activities. That is to say, it separated the activities of Wall Street from the activities of the investment banks. It separated the activities of the investment banks on Wall Street from the commercial banks that you or I would use in downtown Main Street, America. Now, interestingly enough, the years would pass. We had another act in 1956 called the Bank Holding Act, which further separated these financial activities. But by the 90s, in this new neoliberal era, people began to think that the GlassSteagall Act was too restrictive. They began to think that with the invention of these new technologies like computer systems, there was no way that bankers would ever make the mistakes that they had made in the 1930s. They began to think that we had such good information about how markets worked now, about the various things that were available and the various amounts of these things that people were demanding in the marketplace, that there was just no way these issues could happen again. That the original financial crisis had happened not so much because of greed, but because of misinformation. After all, these bankers are not suicidal, the logic went. So, now that we had good information about how the banking system worked, why did we really need a GlassSteagall Act? So in 1999, Bill Clinton, with a bipartisan group of congressmen, passed a thing called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which repealed the GlassSteagall Act. And once again, as we say here on the bottom line, commercial and investment banks could engage each other and consolidate their activities. So why is that important for our story? Because, well, effectively, the financial crisis that happened in the 1930s was to do with the fact that Main Street banks, commercial banks, had given our savings to the investment banks. Interestingly enough, this time around, as we're about to discuss, the amount of cash that had sort of been left floating around in the investment bank system after the collapse of the dot-com bubble bursting meant that the problem that had existed in the 1930s was now going to exist again, but in reverse, because back in the 1930s, what was going to happen was that our savings would be risked and gambled on Wall Street. But now Wall Street was going to gamble. It was going to take its cash and invest in the commercial banks, the downtown banks. It was going to flush cash into the middle class debt system, the mortgage system, for example, the credit card system, car loan system. It was going to make credit available very, very cheaply at deals that people couldn't refuse in order to try to get people on the hook of debt and then extract revenue from them as they would pay the interest over the long term. In this slide we discuss salad bowls. Now, why salad bowls? It's a metaphor really, right? Bankers used to keep loans on their books before the repeal of the GlassSteagall Act. If you or I went to a downtown bank to get a mortgage, that mortgage would generally be owned by the downtown bank, right? The commercial bank. Since GlassSteagall had been repealed, that no longer had to be the case. The bank that we got our mortgage from could sell our mortgage then onto the banks on Wall Street, the investment houses. And those banks were taking in a lot of these mortgages, these credit card packages, these car loan packages, and they were bundling them up. They were paying off a little bit of money to the downtown bank to thank them for their services, and then they were trying to create interesting little salad bowl style packages, a little bit of everything, a mix of credit card debt, a mix of tomatoes and lettuce and all kinds of things, financial vegetables, if you'll forgive the metaphor, and securitizing them, selling them off as packages of mixed assets, with the view that you or I or anyone else who might want to buy these things would see that they were kind of a cool little mix of revenue streams, and that if one of those little bits of things went bad, the rest of it would still be quite good, and yeah, we can always pick the bits out of the salad we don't want anyway, right? So still a very strong investment vehicle. And who, by the way, what sort of people would be buying these salad bowls? Interestingly, they'd be salad bowls sold to town government systems in Scotland, in Norway, in Iceland, that would very, very keen to buy these salads as a way of guaranteeing the pensions to their city employees. These salad bowls look very attractive. They had been AAA rated, in fact, by Standard & Poor's, a ratings agency that exists to measure relative risk of various financial products on Wall Street, including, actually, interesting enough, the debt of nation states. These rating agencies are very powerful creatures because they get to tell the world, they get to tell the market how much various things are worth and how risky they are. And these rating agencies have been saying these salad bowls are fantastic. These securitized assets are fantastic. Now, you know, a borrower then, a city government in Scotland or in Norway would really take this very seriously then if these lending houses were being certified, if the products they were selling were certified by Standard & Poor's and entities like this. But how reliable, in fact, were the salad bowls? That's the real question. A significant part of the salad bowls were related to the value of housing stock in the United States of America, and the real question is how debt worthy were the people that were borrowing these mortgages. In fact, not very debt worthy. The banks, the Wall Street banks, were flush, and they were putting money, injecting money into the commercial bank system quite dramatically. Wall Street banks had little incentive to worry about the credit worthiness of their borrowers because they had so much cash, and the downtown commercial banks were not going to own the mortgages for very long because they were going to sell them on to Wall Street. So they didn't really care about the credit worthiness of the borrowers either. They just saw that all the cash was coming in, and their sole objective was to claim the ticketing revenue that they would get from selling the mortgages onto Wall Street, again because the GlassSteagall Act no longer existed. The borrowers, the punters coming in off the street looking to buy a house, well, they were optimistic too because property values were going up. They'd been going up dramatically for several years, and so there was no reason for them to have any doubt about what was going to happen next. They thought that the value would continue to go up. They were also very happy to see that the banks, flush with cash again, were giving them what were known as teaser rates, right? That is to say that the people were being, the mortgages that were being offered were included special offers like low initial payments, low payments for the first 2 to 3 years of the loan. And then of course they would float then, once the few years were over, the loans would float to levels that were 50 to 100% higher for the remaining 27 to 28 years of the loan. But a lot of people were looking at the houses as items that they could flip, given that the houses were going up every year, the value was going up. The mortgage would stay fixed relative to the value of the house as it was when it was bought. So you could buy a house that you couldn't afford this year, but by next year the asset would be so much value, would have increased in value so much that it would actually be worth more than the mortgage was set for the year you bought it. So this year's stretch is next year's bargain, right? Because if you sold it, you'd get money back, pay off the mortgage, and still have money left over for yourself. So what we have is a situation then, if I can summarize it, we have tremendous amounts of cash flowing into the commercial banking system from Wall Street. We have hungry punters coming in off the street who are only too happy to be able to buy a house that they might not otherwise be able to afford. And also, given that housing prices were going up and up, they believed that they would have strong assets to sit on for the next years to come, and the mortgage wouldn't be such a big deal relative to the rising value of the house. Meanwhile, the downtown banks had no incentive to check the creditworthiness of the people they were lending to because they weren't going to sit on the mortgage for very long. And Wall Street had so much cash and it was making so much money by selling these salad bowls, which had been rated by Standard & Poor's and other agencies as good as gold, that they had little incentive to check whether the creditworthiness of the downtown banks had been fully ascertained or not. So in a way, it was the blind leading the blind. And it leads to the question, who is to blame? If we think about it, perhaps the borrowers are to blame, right? Because, as they say, they had no documentation. They weren't obliged to provide documentation to attest to their creditworthiness. The loans were called LIMDOC or no-doc loans, limited document or no-document loans. The borrowers didn't have to present any evidence of their creditworthiness. They just came in right in off the street, and the banks were giving them mortgages. Maybe the banks were to blame then, but the banks were only doing what they believed Wall Street wanted from them, and there was a market from Wall Street, and the GlassSteagall Act had been repealed, so what was the big deal, right? Maybe the fund managers were to blame then, the folks on Wall Street. Maybe they should have known more about what was going on. Well, in a way, they're just doing what fund managers do, which is make money while the sun shines. And so, in a way, it's a very, very difficult question to sort of ask who is to blame, right? It seems that at every level of the economy, everyone was involved in being overly exuberant and assuming that this good thing that was going on would keep going forever. But of course, as we've said already, that which goes up must someday come down. So it's not clear that it's fair to blame any one sector of people. They all seemed to be involved in this sort of collective hallucination. So in this slide, now that we've talked about salad bowls and we understand the metaphor and why it relates to what we've been talking about, that the finance banks like Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers were issuing these salad bowls to various buyers and purchasers around the world, which people were investing their pensions into, effectively, not just in America but around the world, their pension funds. And we know that the revenue stream that all of this was drawing on was potentially built on a house of cards, because no one was checking the creditworthiness of the people that were borrowing for these mortgages, when no one was checking how much in debt these people already were. The cash was available and no one was asking the right questions. Now that's obviously a bad situation, and you might ask yourself, well, why wouldn't the government regulate that? Why wouldn't the government police it and step in? Surely that's what they're there to do. They're there to be the regulator. To answer that question, we need to think about this concept, moral hazard, and we need to evaluate it against the risk of what we can consider to be a global credit shock. And I want to explain that to you now, if I may. The dominant interpretation of the financial crisis has been that it is a crisis of this thing, this sphere, or this entity called the economy, right? And what we saw when the banks imploded was that a lot of credit disappeared, right? A lot of cash in the economy disappeared. And so we think that, well, seeing as that's happened, surely the solution would be to re-inject cash, for the government to come along and re-inject cash into the economy, right? So we think about the crisis within the chronological confines of its taking place. We think about it narrowly, okay? And our goal in assessing the financial crisis is to inject liquidity, to inject cash into the economy. And we're, in a way, because the stakes were so high, we were willing to do that at pretty much any cost, right? In other words, even if it took nationalizing the banks, we would do that. We would, in other words, ask the people to take ownership of the banks, effectively, therefore, also taking ownership of the mistakes of the banks, right? Interestingly, then saying that we were going to transfer the burden of fixing the system away from the banks themselves and onto everyday people. We've been talking a lot about everyday life, and now we're seeing everyday life being saddled, activity in everyday life being saddled with this burden of paying off these banks, right? So let's think about this concept, moral hazard, for a minute. You know, if you or I are driving a car and we don't wear a seatbelt, we are, you know, many people would say being stupid. Ironically, if you have a safety belt and you're wearing one, there's a perverse incentive effect that takes place. You might actually be more likely to drive fast wearing a seatbelt, right? You might actually be more likely to take risks as a driver wearing a seatbelt, because you know that it's there to save you if you make a mistake, if something bad happens. Well, the same principle applies to the banks. They are more likely to engage in moral hazard-like behavior, to drive that car faster, knowing that effectively they have a seatbelt on. So what was that seatbelt, right? The seatbelt was this idea that if the banks were to experience difficulties in the market as a result of having lent out too much money, the government would be there to protect them and back them up, not because the government's nice, but because these banks are so big and such a big part of the US economy that they knew that this liquidity effect would happen, right? They knew that were these banks, that the government would look at the situation and say, my God, these banks are so big that if we were to lose one, surely the economic system would collapse. And so the banks obviously looked at the moral hazard situation, and they looked at the government's likely spread of options were the banks to have trouble. And they said, well, you know, what the government's going to want to do is bail us out rather than have a huge financial crisis in the United States of America, and possibly even the world, a global credit shock and a global deflation. So the banks very intelligently said, rational actors as they are, we'll take it to the ringer, right? We will actually be able to exploit our status as being too big to fail and make money from this at the expense of the taxpayer, perhaps at the expense ultimately of the entire financial system. So it's a kind of a short-sighted strategy, it's a cynical strategy, but it's the strategy that they played at the same time. And this really is a fact now that we have to sort of ask about in evaluating the hypothesis that seems to be put forward to us in this context of the financial crisis. Is the economy a self-contained entity of circulation of goods and services that exists as a goal unto itself, which we must serve? Or is it something that should exist to serve our interests and our needs? The gentleman in the picture here is Alan Greenspan. He was the chairman of the Fed for many years. He was appointed under Ronald Reagan. He's an interesting person to think about as we reflect on where we are today and how everyday life has been impacted by the financial crisis. Huge cost of this catastrophe to the average American. In February 2008, 63,000 jobs had disappeared. It was the second consecutive loss, the second quarterly loss in a row. By January 2009, a year later, 600,000 jobs had been lost. It was the highest job loss in 34 years that had been recorded. December 2007, which we identify as the start of the current recession, since December 2007, the US economy has lost 3.6 million jobs. And, there's a huge human effect, a huge human impact from job loss for any one person. For 3.6 million people, obviously that's very dramatic indeed. Now, for a brief time, digesting these numbers and their spectacular significance, it looked like we might be about to have a serious conversation about the economic ideology that led us to this point. That is to say, neoliberalism, radical free market ideology, a non-interfering attitude from government, the idea of putting the economy first and people second. It looked like we might have had a conversation about that. Alan Greenspan here, for example, is quoted as saying in front of a commission of inquiry, I made a mistake in presuming that the self-interested nature of these organizations, specifically banks and others, were such that as they were best capable of protecting their own shareholders and their equity in their firms. In other words, these banks, he's saying, why would they have gone to the brink? Why would they have taken so many risks that they might have put themselves out of business? He's saying he did not understand it, and he's saying that his worldview didn't account for that possibility, that Lehman Brothers might take so many risks that it might actually be willing to call government on its cards, right? And Lehman Brothers, in the game of chicken, lost. The government let them fail. But the effects of Lehman Brothers collapsing were so grave that the government then, in the game of chicken with the other investment banks, it lost. It was the one that had to blink. In other words, it was the one that had to step in and bail everyone out. So Greenspan is saying, in the aftermath of this context, or this crisis, that the ideology might be flawed. And we had this moment where it looked like we might have this conversation. Today, though, it looks like this moment has passed, because the bailouts have continued, and we know now that the banks have been giving themselves huge bonuses, despite the terrible impact of their behavior on the everyday people of the country and around the world. They are rewarding themselves while everyone else suffers. And when people see that and when they hear that, they feel angry and they want to react. They want to contest the way that our everyday lives have become financialized and pressured as a result of these actions. In the game of chicken with the other investment banks, it lost. It was the one that had to blink. In other words, it was the one that had to step in and bail everyone out. So Greenspan is saying, in the aftermath of this context, or this crisis, that the ideology might be flawed. And we had this moment where it looked like we might have this conversation. Today, though, it looks like this moment has passed, because the bailouts have continued, and we know now that the banks have been giving themselves huge bonuses, despite the terrible impact of their behavior on the everyday people of the country and around the world. They are rewarding themselves while everyone else suffers. And when people see that and when they hear that, they feel angry and they want to react. They want to contest the way that our everyday lives have become financialized and pressured as a result of these actions. Now, all over the world, people's lives were hit by this logic of needing to resort to liquidity. To do this, governments had to borrow. If they borrowed, they had to be sure that they were going to be able to pay back what they were borrowing. And this means cutting expenditure elsewhere. This means cutting things like health, education, welfare, and we call this austerity. Austerity is an important concept here. We have the video, for example, from Mark Blythe, which I asked you guys to watch in accompaniment to this lecture. He talks a lot about austerity, and what he says is that austerity matters because while you don't know it, it drives the cost of your lives up. For example, your schooling is heavily subsidized. People in Ohio, people in Florida, people in Kentucky, they don't pay the true cost of their education, especially higher education. The states subsidize education dramatically. But the costs go up in times of austerity because, if people have lost their jobs, if people are not as well paid as they used to, that means the tax take is lower. That means that the economy is shrinking and the government is not taking in as much money from taxation as it used to, which means that there's less money available to subsidize things like education. And unless the government is willing to borrow in order to make up the difference, there won't be much room for maneuver. Schooling's going to get cut, education's going to get cut, higher education I mean. So this is a pattern of behavior then, because it was a global recession. The implosion of Lehman Brothers affected everyone all over the world, but especially in the Western world, where these pension funds that we mentioned earlier on were most acutely dependent on activity in Wall Street. So how are people going to react to the fact that the possibilities in their everyday life for education, for healthcare, things like this, were suddenly being constrained? We could start the answer to that question by looking to the people of Iceland. In March 6, 2010, the people of Iceland came together and refused by referendum to bail out their banks. They were one of the first countries hit by this crisis. And the people of Iceland said they'd sooner let the banks collapse than take the debts of these banks onto their own backs. The people of Iceland did not think that the policy conclusions were not up for debate, right? They did not think that the idea that the economy should be the primary goal, the maintenance of the economy should be the primary goal. They did not think that that observation went without saying, right? To the contrary, in fact, they wanted to have a very serious conversation, a debate about the logic that they were being asked to support. So that was in 2010 in March. But by the spring of 2011, we were starting to see similar popular uprisings, if you will, people coming out on the street to demonstrate their opposition to this logic of the economy coming first, that the bailouts should come first, that the liquidity of the Wall Street banks should be the priority for us all. People came out on the streets to challenge that logic. We saw the Arab Spring, and then we saw the global Occupy Wall Street movement. From Greece to New York, as Paul Mason, the BBC journalist, argued in his well-known book, it's kicking off everywhere, you should read it if you haven't read it, things were sparking off, right? People were coming together from hugely diverse backgrounds. They were not the stereotypical hippie protesters of the 1960s, these were ordinary people. These were not veteran protesters. They were just everyday people coming together. A lot of students, in fact, most of which would have never protested ever before in their entire lives. But they were angry with the fact that the conditions that they needed to be in place in order for them to be able to live the promise of their ordinary lives was being turned upside down. They felt it was important to get out on the street to wake people up to the idea that the world of their everyday life was being choked off, and that perhaps contrary to what the economists were arguing, what the experts were arguing, austerity was not the logic that went without saying, that austerity was not a foregone conclusion. The girl in the slide here is an example of exactly what I'm talking about here, right? Telling people none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free, right? Our conflation of our own political freedom with the prosperity of the economy is a false one, she's saying. In fact, living for the economy is a trap. It's not liberation, it's the opposite. And she's quoting the philosopher Goethe here in this context. As our author, Matt Davies, puts it, then these were people who refused to have their voices excluded, who refused to let their opinions be seen as less important than those of the economists. And that's a vital point for us to consider. Now, as Davies argues, there were a lot of videos on YouTube and elsewhere made after 2008. A lot of people, many of whom were well-known economists themselves, wanting to get in on the action of telling their story, their version of the story, of just what had gone wrong with the economy. Now, I've put some links to these videos, or some of them at least, in your syllabus, and you can watch them for yourself. There's the Blythe video, and then there's also the David Harvey video, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And they're all pretty short, which is good, you know, because they tell their stories pithily and directly. But as Matt Davies argues, there's kind of an interesting thing going on with all these videos. They tend to locate the crisis as something specific within a domain of activity or a place which we call the economy. And we've talked about this a little bit in the intro to the class and throughout the class, but maybe it's time to get specific now. What is this thing called the economy? Well, for most economists, it's the place where goods and services circulate, where t-shirts and cardigans and cans of Coke circulate. Flat screen televisions circulate. They are made, they are put into the marketplace where they're bought and sold, sometimes multiple times over, especially common with cars, for example. Now, as you know, throughout this course, we've focused a lot on the question of images of thought, or ways in which we imagine the world around us. Each of these theories we've looked at is also kind of a picture of truth, as we've said. Theorists like to think that their picture of truth corresponds to actual truth. But the question we've been asking every module is, does it? In this instance, is the economy merely the space where goods and services circulate? Or what truths does that image of truth, that story, prevent from coming forward? Davies, for example, talks about videos from organizations like Say It Visually and Inspire Learning, and we can learn all about them if we read that chapter, and he gives us links that we can watch those videos. And interestingly, they all seem to have this habit of using really generic representations of people, stick figures basically, to describe what happened in the crisis. One of the video makers, Jonathan Jarvis, actually adds a little more color to his video. He starts by showing a normal stick figure family, and then he shows a less responsible family of stick figures. And his point is to try to imply that perhaps the sphere of circulation, flat screen televisions and cardigans, it would have been just fine if everything had been left the way it was and not interfered with by anyone. We might not have even had any crisis at all if everyone had just played the game by its rules. But there were irresponsible people, and you can see them here in the image on the screen. We see overweight people with lots of children smoking, consuming alcohol, tattoos. Think about the representation that's coming forward here. These are not middle-class people. These are not wealthy people who have worked hard and who know how to be disciplined in their lives. These are people who have habits that are not productive, having too many children, being overweight, drinking, smoking. Clearly these people are not very sort of thoughtful about the way they need to live. In other words, we're talking about poor people. We're talking about people at the bottom part of society who maybe don't have the best education. The problem with a lot of that is it's stereotyping. It's invoking a stereotypical notion to sort of explain or imagine the crisis for us, and to imagine where the responsibility for the crisis might lie. So with this image, the image then of the crisis as a liquidity crunch located in the sphere of circulation of goods and services, indeed, but caused by interference by poor people who didn't know how to act responsibly when they entered into that sphere of circulation. And I guess what we have to ask in relation to this creation of a myth of the financial crisis is, well, what's left out? What, in invoking this sort of snapshot or image of truth that's to help us imagine or explain the crisis to ourselves, as with the ticking time bomb scenario, as with all the other scenarios we've looked at, like the prisoner's dilemma, again, what's left out? What are these powerful, persuasive, seductive images of truth leaving out or forgetting about the reason the financial crisis happened? Indeed, was this stick figure family here, smoking, drinking, overweight, lots of children, were they not making their payments because they were lazy or irresponsible, or were there perhaps other reasons? That's the sort of question that Matt Davis wants us to ask. And to ask that question, he turns then to David Harvey. So talking about David Harvey then, as a counterpoint to the previous video, here we find a challenge to think carefully about how we organize our perceptions. David Harvey was relatively well known prior to the financial crisis, but really only among like-minded academics. He became a bit more famous after he made the video depicted here in the slide, The Crises of Capitalism, and there's a link for this video in your syllabus. So Harvey's video told quite a different story. Now, of course, as Davies argues, his version of events is no more true than anyone else's version of events. It's still a story, it's still a snapshot, it's still an image of truth. But there's images of truth and there's images of truth. What's interesting about Harvey's video is not so much that it's true, but because he's one of the few people to make one of these videos who does not talk about the crisis merely as a liquidity crunch, merely as a crisis that happened within the sphere of circulation. Rather, instead of it being a crisis in the sphere of circulation of goods and services, flat-screen televisions and cardigans, it's actually a crisis of the sphere of production. His view is less then about barriers to and hiccups in the sphere of circulation, right? Interference in the sphere of circulation, and more about the idea that somehow this crisis is really actually quite a normal part of what we should expect to be happening in a system based on, ultimately, a capitalist mode of production. So this is what Davies means when he says that Harvey makes the making visible. There's this really interesting point in the chapter where Davies is discussing Harvey and says that Harvey makes making visible. Makes making visible. That's an interesting phrase, right? It asks how we can expose the underpinning manufacturing, or indeed production, visible. How do we take what is hidden underneath the ground, if you will, the underpinning foundations of a house? They're not in plain sight. So we have to expose them diagrammatically. We have to look at the architectural plans of the house in order to see them. And so Harvey's asking this question, not what happened within the sphere of circulation, but how the sphere of circulation was composed in the first place. In other words, he wants to get into the level of the blueprints of the house to see what's under the surface, what's holding it all up. So he's asking the question ultimately about politics. We got this crazy, turbulent financial system in the first place because of politics, despite the fact that the experts are constantly telling us that politics and economics should be kept separate to each other, and that we end up having crises only when we interfere with this thing politically. We see that actually that's a bit of a myth, and that underneath it, well, the point being, it's political anyway. It's political already anyway. So the answer then is the political system of capitalism. Companies in a free market system, you see, want to make things for the marketplace, and this is Harvey's argument. They desire to make things for the marketplace, but they have to do so at a profit. And they will try to find ways to spend less on wages and benefits for workers if they can, in order to guarantee their profit. The problem is that this means that workers are less well paid over time, meaning that the workers can't buy as many products in the marketplace in time. And we've already talked in the build-up to the financial crisis that preoccupies us here about productivity going up, but wages staying relatively stagnant throughout the 80s and 90s. So we know, historically speaking, that what Harvey is saying is true. Workers couldn't buy as many products in the marketplace as they used to be able to. And so, says Harvey, to maintain profitability for these capitalist corporations, and thereby also maintain the capitalist system to reproduce it, make sure it's healthy and vibrant. We call it the economy. He calls it the capitalist system. The system rather, had to look for another way to maintain profits. And this is the paradox. We want to pay workers less in capitalism, but if we pay them less to a point, they'll start consuming less, and that leaves us with a paradox because there's a crisis of oversupply, right? We don't have enough profits, we make more and more stuff, workers are buying less and less. So in order to rectify this then, periodically, says Harvey, we're going to have a setback. We're going to have a financial crisis where a lot of this stuff is going to have to get rearranged. This is where Mark Blyth comes in to play. Now, many people suggest austerity as an approach to this. David Harvey discusses it. He also discusses the irrationality and the non-democratic way in which it's happening, and he discusses the Occupy movement as a response to this. But it's a couple of years after the Occupy movement now, and we can look back on it and ask, what has it accomplished? Interestingly, people have not really paid attention, I think, to what David Harvey and Mark Blyth have been arguing. We're still bailing out the banks, not just in America but elsewhere. I mean, we think about the case that I'm particularly familiar with, the Irish financial crisis. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance told the Irish people that the financial crisis was happening because people had partied too much, basically. They had bought too many things. They had spent too much money on luxury goods and services. Kind of the similar story that was being told here in the United States. And this was the idea that austerity then is the pain after the party. But as Blyth argues, you have to beware of the so-called fallacy of composition, which is this idea that it's a good idea for us to try to clean house all at once. He says that it's a very dangerous thing for the economy to believe this fallacy of composition, right? If the government is trying to balance its balance sheet, and individuals are trying to balance their balance sheets, and banks are trying to balance their balance sheets, then basically everyone's hunkering down. And what that can do, he says, is crater the economy, because it collapses demand. If everyone's busy paying off their debts, then who's buying anything, right? No one's going to the grocery store to buy stuff. Those cardigans and flat screen televisions we've been talking about aren't getting bought. And if they're not getting bought, they're not getting produced. And if they're not getting produced, there's no need for labor, so people are losing their jobs, and it sets off this negative spiral. So the fallacy of composition is a term that he uses to warn us that just because some people need to balance their books doesn't mean everyone should. And in this instance, he's arguing there are times when really, actually, it's the government at the end of the day that needs to take on debt. It's the government that needs to not balance its balance sheets when everyone else is, right? Because if government is not there spending money as the sort of spender of last resort, really there's nothing else keeping the economy going. There's nothing else maintaining the energy in the economy. The private sector is very, very shy of investing. So really it has to be government that invests. This is an argument that actually goes back to John Maynard Keynes, and who we've talked about a little bit already, the World War II economist who decided to set up this thing called fiscal economics. So if austerity doesn't work then, and the Occupy movement did its best to draw attention to this, where are we now? The Occupy movement seems to have faded into history somewhat. It might come back, but who knows, right? For now, it's not around. Then why are governments pursuing it, right? Why are people not in the streets? What's happened? What explains the fact that Occupy failed and that we are still doing what we were doing beforehand? We're still pursuing austerity in Europe and in the United States. Well, says Mark Blyth, it's because of the logic of common sense. We discussed this in another class vis-a-vis Gramsci, right? We think we're doing the right thing. We think we have to save the economy to save ourselves. So we're sacrificing our lives for this thing called the economy. We want to be good citizens. We want to act responsibly. And the story of common sense tells us that responsibility is to sacrifice for the economy. And we know spending money we don't have is bad, so it makes sense to think that the government shouldn't spend money that it doesn't have either. But, says Mark Blyth, this is really just one of those moments in history where that intuition doesn't really work very well. This is the moment where the comparison between what individuals do in their households and what the nation state does don't actually seem like direct equivalents. The nation state is different because it can print money. We can't. So even if we have to balance our books, the nation state has other options. It doesn't always have to balance its books. And besides, it's a nation state, so its promise is more sustainable in the long run than our promise. Its creditworthiness is more sustainable in the long run than ours. And even if it has a lot of debt, it can still convince the market to lend more to it, usually more than you or I can, more by a long shot, right? Because there's so many people backing up the good word of the nation state. So, you know, at the end of the day, as Mark Blyth argues, the bottom 40% of people never did well in the boom, but they're the ones who actually rely on government services. Now they are the ones that are being asked to pay for the sins of the people at the top. In effect, that's a type of class politics. If the result is a kind of socialism, so far as we can see today, it's socialism for the rich. We keep bailing out the rich, they keep giving big bonuses to themselves, and we continue to believe that this is somehow common sense. Mark Blyth, David Harvey, their whole basis is to challenge this idea. What we've looked at in this class, what Matt Davies has pointed to, is in fact that rather than focusing on who's right or who's wrong, what matters is where we locate the phenomena of the crisis. And in this instance, clearly, everyday life, the constraints on everyday life, the demands of everyday life, created logics, created desires for a standard of living. People wanted to have living standards that were as good as, if not better, than the generation that had gone before, because that's what generations do, and every generation prior to this one did have an improvement on the previous generation's lifestyle. This generation will not have that. This is the first generation in 3 or 4 generations in the United States that will actually have a less comfortable existence. than the generation before. This is the first generation in a long time that will not do as well as the generation before. And that's hard for people to take. I think that explains the frustration that they're experiencing in their everyday lives, and it explains why, to explain the financial crisis, we have to go beyond simply talking about liquidity in the thing that we call the economy and start to talk about how people's lives matter, both in the way we create value and also in the way we extract responsibility in terms of paying for the debt of the rich. So that's the end of this lecture. I hope it's been profitable for you. It's a really important topic. I hope you guys will continue to pay attention to it, as soon you'll be ending this course. But this crisis will probably go on for a long time to come. It will affect your lives for a long time to come, just as it's affected mine. And really, the point of this lecture, the point I think of this lecture has been to draw attention to the fact that in our everyday lives we struggle now to be full citizens, to be political. Hopefully in a class like this, in a lecture like this, you see the urgent need to think carefully and critically about the constraints that are being put on your own lives and the sacrifices you're being asked to make as you move forward into your adult lives and into your professional lives. Thanks for your time. Talk to you soon.